Thank you for being with me today. I have been thinking about how children's stories can often teach important truths. I know a lot about children's stories. My wife and I have 6 children. When they were young, I told them a story every night. Telling these stories was one of my favorite parts about being a dad. Many of the stories had lessons about how we ought to live. I think we are wise when we remember those lessons as we grow older. One story is of mythical King Midas from ancient Greece. It goes something like this. King Midas had a kind heart and loved only 3 things: his little daughter, his rose garden, and gold. After saving a beloved servant of the god Dionysus, King Midas was granted a wish. While he may have wished for something to bless his people, like an unlimited supply of pure water, or soil that always grew grain abundantly, or a school with copies of all the books in the world, he chose to be greedy instead. He wished that anything he touched would turn to gold. At first, his wish seemed marvelous. His chair and table turned to gold as soon as he touched them. But his joy was short-lived. His servants prepared him a feast, but he was unable to eat anything, because whatever he touched turned to gold. Leaving his palace to find solace in his vast rose garden, he found his daughter there. Quickly, she ran to give him a hug. Before he could stop her, she threw her arms around his waist and turned to gold. He wept bitterly, and when his tears fell on his beloved roses, they too turned to gold. Recognizing how foolish he had been, he begged Dionysus to take away what he knew then was a curse. Because he had served others so well in the past, Dionysus agreed to do so, and all was restored to its rightful condition. King Midas learned that his greed could destroy everything he held dear. This simple, profound fable is a lesson my children and grandchildren and all of us ought to reflect upon today. I'd like to remember King Midas in the context of what is happening in the U.S. today. We know that U.S. history has been constantly tainted with avarice and greed. The desire to get rich quickly with little effort hasn't been our best character trait. Ralph Waldo Emerson remarked, "Ah, my poor countrymen, Yankees and dollars have such inextricable association that the words ought to rhyme. In New York and Boston and Providence, you cannot pass 2 men in the street without the word escaping them in the very moment of encounter: dollars." Well, there are different kinds of greed, different manifestations of the same sickness. Some are not particularly harmful, though they are always disturbing. The kind of greed I'd like to talk about today is the worst kind. This is the greed when someone is willing to exchange sacred things for momentary wealth or pleasure. Trading sacred things for fleeting, selfish happiness has inflicted enormous harm on people and the natural world over the entire course of human history. It isn't remotely possible for me to do any justice to greed's long and tragic saga. I will just say that we are living at a time when the worst kind of greed is on open display in our nation. I'm going to call this kind of greed Midas greed. Throughout our history, Midas greed has usually operated somewhat behind the scenes because it is so repulsive. When the truth behind it is sometimes ferreted out, we are aghast. And maybe we have felt a twinge of shame when we recognize in our own hearts that Midas greed is not entirely a stranger to our personal longings. The place of greed in our nation feels different now, as we seem to have few social stigmas attached to it. It seems to me that we have elevated greed to acceptability and even worship. The character Gordon Gekko from the 1987 film Wall Street comes to mind when we reflect on Midas greed. He said, quote, "The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right, greed works, greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms, greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind. End of quote. Is there any truth in Gordon Gekko's words? When we consider Midas greed, that is greed at its worst, that he couldn't have been more mistaken. This kind of greed is among the 7 deadly sins first outlined in Christianity about 1700 years ago. Those of us who are aware of greed's impact on American society have questioned much in today's national milieu. Some of this is generated by, or at least reflected by, the current Trump administration. For example, on March 11th, 2025, President Trump invited the Tesla company to bring 5 of their new vehicles to the White House lawn for a promotional campaign. This was done to support President Trump's billionaire friend Elon Musk, whose ill-informed and costly federal budget cut decisions had alienated much of Tesla's customer base. Tesla sales have plunged dramatically in the US and across the world. To bolster the company, President Trump promoted the company as he sat in one of the vehicles on the White House lawn and talked excitedly about how he would be buying a new $80,000 Tesla soon. Some of us were unsettled by the display. For the average US citizen, the White House, also known as the People's House, is a powerful symbol of our democracy. It is a physical manifestation of the principles enshrined in our Constitution. To use it as a backdrop for selling cars to benefit one of the richest men in the world seemed Midas-like to us. Also in March, President Trump promoted his global trade war by appealing to the Midas in the American people, especially as some of us hesitated to support damaging, long-standing relationships with trading partners by the proposed stiff tariffs. To help swing public opinion, he said of his tariff plan, quote, "We are going to become so rich, you're not going to know where to spend all that money. I'm telling you, just watch," end of quote. A month later, he was using the same kind of rhetoric. Quote, "This is a great time to get rich, richer than ever before," end of quote. I don't think President Trump and those with Midas greed were thinking about nourishing food, rose gardens, and little children. Monetary profit and monetary profit alone was touted as being the only motivation we would need to justify damaging relationships developed over decades by the painstaking efforts of millions of people. I love finding good used books. Often for less than $1, I have found books full of wisdom and insights, authored by great literary figures whose words have been nearly forgotten in the vortex of modern life. This was the case about 15 years ago, when at a library sale I found a book titled Land of the Free by Herbert Agar, published in 1935. Herbert Agar was an American journalist and historian who lived from 1897 to 1980. He won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1934. I had never heard of Mr. Agar before finding his book at a used library book sale, but for 50 cents I was willing to take a chance on what he had to say. Incidentally, when I bought his book, no one had checked it out for over 60 years. As I began reading Land of the Free, I was awed by the message. Each page pulled me further and further into his impeccable logic and his love for cultural America. Written in the middle of the Great Depression, Agar had much to say about how we got to that tragic state and what we could do to avoid falling into decay again. I paid 50 cents for his book. Had I known what a treasure it is, I would gladly have paid over 100 times more than I did. The sacrifice of ideals that never should have been compromised led us right into the fury of the Great Depression. Midas greed was running amok across the nation in the 1920s. Agar wrote on page 72, quote, "Above all, it is vital that we should separate our national heroes from our national devils. There is no room in one nation's heart for Jefferson and Lincoln, Rockefeller and Jay Gould. for the men who gave us a vision of greatness and the men who dishonored that vision before the world. We have free will. It is our privilege to choose either pair, but let us stop pretending to choose both. End of quote. I've shared my admiration for Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln in earlier messages, and will expand on that in future messages. Their antitheses, Rockefeller and Gould, are not honored. John D. Rockefeller and Jay Gould were notorious robber barons who thought America's primary reason for being was to enable people like themselves to become obscenely wealthy. They were grifters who took advantage of the government and then used their wealth to crush their competition. They made King Midas, who repented of his errors rather quickly, seem like a novice in the ways of greed. Throughout Land of the Free, Agar contrasts their vision of America with the one championed by leaders like Jefferson and Lincoln, who didn't think wealth accumulation was the most important reason for America's existence. These leaders were not opposed to prosperity, but they were opposed to counterfeit prosperity gained by greed. They wanted another kind of prosperity, one gained by diligent, honest effort, strengthened by faith. Agar wrote of our heady reliance on the Midas greed that characterized America during the so-called Roaring Twenties, quote, "And there is one lesson we ought to learn from those slack, disgusting years. If a great nation worships private enterprise, it will land in the sty." This is not to say that enterprise is a bad thing. It is on par with many of our appetites and instincts, good if subjected to a larger purpose, deadly if taken as an end in itself. Enterprise, if allowed to seek its own ends, unruled by social purposes, will destroy a real system of private property, destroy liberty, and enslave a nation to avarice, one of the least attractive of the 7 deadly sins. End of quote. If our elected officials, other leaders, and ourselves are wise, we will all remember the lessons of King Midas. Neglecting these lessons is folly. Agar summarized such thoughts when he wrote, quote, "For a long time we have done nothing to protect freedom, to protect democracy, to protect equality, for fear that anything we did might hurt profits. If we are to renew our pride in America, we must reverse this plan. A state that does not dare take a moral stand for fear the very rich might disapprove is a state that will not survive." He added, "When America set out to become a land of the free, based on private property and self-government, our fathers were setting politics above economics. They were founding a state on moral principles." End of quote. A state founded on moral principles? Now that sounds inspiring to me. Where do we stand today? To many of us, it appears that our national will has swung away from the golden rule and toward the golden calf. We consider statements and priorities advanced by the current administration and wonder if Midas greed will destroy much that we hold dear. This is not to say that any previous administration has been perfect in this regard, but the current administration seems to be embracing Midas greed wholeheartedly. There is immeasurable sadness in attempting to reach the American people by offering nothing more than the opportunity to get rich quick. Though we've had many stumbles along the way, I believe that most Americans still want to believe. Our toil, our genius, our sacrifices, and our unity count for more meaningful ends than to get rich quick. Agar concludes his book with this thought, quote, "The American people are sick with the desire to honor their country. They will follow the man who offers them a country that is honorable. No nation can be great without the self-confidence, the sense of duty, the will to sacrifice, which come only with a conviction of moral rightness. The first man who stops bribing our people with promises of pottage, the first man who dares take a high line with the American public, will get a response that may surprise him. My prayer is that he will not be a fascist, that he will be a man who chooses to revive America." End of quote. When we tell our children King Midas-like stories, let's be sure they always know we intend to live by their truths, even when the temptations are great. They look to us as examples, and our actions will always be more significant to them than our words. Until next time, I want to wish you all the best from the wilderness.